Are you ready to hear about more heinous shit that the American empire has done throughout the world and the ways that the press went along with it? Welcome back to Champagne Anarchism. All right, today we are finishing this incredible book, Manufacturing Consent by Herman and Chomsky. We are going to do chapter 6 today, and that means that we're at the end. We'll do a little bit on the conclusion, but this is the end of this unbelievable book. And if you have made it this far, if you've made it through this book, and I hope you're reading along with the series because there's earlier stuff that I think is really important for understanding this chapter and indeed understanding the entire book. But if you have made it to this point, then congratulations. This is a fantastic thing that you've just done. This is just an important book. One of those books that I think should be generally kind of a must read for humanity. This is something that I think it's safe to say has probably influenced the way that you look at the world, the way that you read media sources from here on out. It certainly was a profound influence for me when I read it several years ago. This is one of those books that I think you just can't avoid. And I think people who read this book walk away from it fundamentally changed, and I would hope better people living in the society that we live in. Now, if you haven't seen the other videos or you do want to read other books like this, you can go check out the channel at patreon.com/Champagne Anarchism. All of this stuff, this main feed stuff, is absolutely free, and it just will talk about Emma Goldman's Anarchism and Other Essays next time, but there's also previous books that we've done that are on the channel right now. Frans Fanon's The Wretched of the Earth, and of course, Capitalism, a Ghost Story by Arundhati Roy. So those are both up on the channel, and you can go in your own time, read along with those books, which I also think are just tremendously important. But yeah, we'll dig into this. As I say, chapter 6, this is closing the Indochina Wars. This is the Indochina Wars part 2. Last week, we took a look at Vietnam, and now we will talk about Laos and Cambodia. And I should say at the outset, just because a lot of people in my life say Lao, even though a lot of the time people say Laos in English, I tend to say Lao as well. I know opinions differ on what the correct pronunciation is, so just to set out at the beginning, throughout this I'll be saying Lao as in Pathet Lao, but Laos is not wrong. It's just sort of the English pronunciation of the Laotian word. Anyway, that's neither here nor there. Last week we talked about Vietnam, and now we're turning to some of the other victims of the Second Indochina War. Remember that this is the Second Indochina War, and we will also be talking about the Third Indochina War, which is Vietnam's toppling of the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia. But the Second Vietnam War, typically around the rest of the world, is known as the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War. This is the war that Vietnam fights against the United States and South Vietnam. We're going to be spending just a little bit of time with Laos in this chapter and a lot of time with Cambodia. And we're going to also take a quick look at the conclusion to this book. We're not going to deal too much with the conclusion just because it's worth looking through quickly, but you can dive in on your own time and read through Herman and Chomsky's conclusions. I don't think there's anything particularly new in the conclusion, apart from a couple bits that we'll touch on that you won't have already got from the main book. But just to say, this is an overview of their thoughts here and a couple other pointed comments. So for sure worth reading, but we won't spend too much time on it in this talk. But without further ado, let's get right into it. We'll start with Laos. Now, over the course of the war, which officially lasted from 1964 to 1975, the U.S. dropped more than 2 million tons of bombs on Laos. That's about 1 ton per person if you look at, that's just under 1 ton of explosive material per person if you look at the population statistics. Laos has a reasonably small population. But the story actually starts earlier than 1965. It actually starts, starts far back in the past than French invasion and all of that. But as far as the U.S. is concerned, it starts in 1954 when you have the Geneva Accords. Now, the 1954 Geneva Accords, just like they did in Vietnam, they set out this path to a resolution here. And just like they pushed for a political settlement in Vietnam, they also allowed for a political settlement in Laos and Cambodia. But the U.S. didn't really care. Remember, again, they are trying to stop dominoes from falling in Southeast Asia. back to domino theory, right? If one of these countries falls, others will fall after it, and all of a sudden the entire region is under the thumb of the communists. This is what the US is really concerned about at the time. And while it may sound simplistic, it is quite simplistic. It's what they were dealing with in the State Department at the time. Now, in Laos, the United States tried to block a political settlement at all costs, and even at various points, the military infiltrated in civilian guise, which is just a flagrant violation of that UN agreement. And the U.S. aid also started to flow. At one point, Herman and Chomsky note that 100% of the military budget came from the U.S. for Laos. But despite this, Laos still holds elections and the left wins. Now, this is not quite a leftist government. This is more of a national union government between the Prince Suvarnabhumi and the communist Pathet Lao. But the Pathet Lao really received the majority vote share and had a significant presence in parliament, and so that had to go. So in the end, none of these initial leftist victories really won anything at all because the government collapsed anyway. Now, why did it collapse? There are a few reasons, but one of the main contributing reasons is that the U.S. withdrew all of its aid and put tremendous pressure on the new government. Helped foment a coup as well with pro-Western kind of neutralist allies. And even that new neutralist government that came in was also overthrown by the ultra-rightist. This is General Phumi Nosavan, who you have probably heard of before if you've read any of Laotian history. Herman and Chomsky put this all pretty simply. This is a quote from them on page 254. They say, quote, "After U.S. clients won the 1960 elections, rigged so crudely that even the most pro-U.S. observers were appalled, civil war broke out, with the USSR and China backing a coalition extending over virtually the entire political spectrum apart from the extreme right, which was backed by the U.S. So again, you have a civil war, but a civil war, why? It's because global superpowers are getting involved with local Laotian politics, again centered around this domino theory, and the U.S. finds itself backing the ultra-extreme right. Again, this is General Nosavan. And none of this had to happen at all. This is all because of that initial U.S. intervention. And maybe even beyond that French intervention, we're limiting the discussion to the United States right now because Laotian history is really, really intense and extremely complicated and fascinating, obviously. But we're going to limit the discussion today just to what's happening up to 1988 in manufacturing consent. Now, during that Civil War, the U.S. really ramped up its intervention. So clandestine operations, they start in 1961, and then regular bombing starts by 1964. And although a lot of this was kind of a sideshow to the main event in Vietnam, the secret bombing campaign in Laos was enormous. But most of this is completely hidden from the American public at the time. And we really don't get these revelations until many years later when documents start to come out that show the true extent of this bombing campaign. And it is impressive. But the fact remains that throughout this period, the media was reporting very, very little about what was actually going on in the country. The foreign press was a little bit better, but by the time the New York Times got around to it, remember the bombing starts in 64, the New York Times doesn't write their first actual article about this until 1969. And remember the 5 filters that we talked about when we talked about the propaganda model at the beginning. All of this information that they are receiving, these reporters, is coming through these filters, right? It's being filtered down to them, and the sources that they're using are directly from the United States military-industrial complex and its PR machine. Everything. So is it any particular surprise that these journalists are reporting the way they are? Probably not. Is it a shame that they didn't do further, extensive, more reporting against this American war machine? Yeah, of course. But what can we really expect at this point? You've read the rest of this book. This is just not how this goes. By the way, at this time, the Hmong people who were enlisted by the U.S. military against the Pathet Lao were devastated. They were displaced. The land that that they lived on was bombed repeatedly. Herman and Chomsky say beyond recognition. And when the U.S. later commented on this and started to really reckon with this, they would end up calling the Hmong people victims of communism, which is a very interesting term, right? Because they're not. They're just not at all. And then when you get this New York Times analysis, this kind of post-mortem analysis of what happened in Laos from the New York Times, they still held that even at this time they knew, a tenth of the population was killed. Again, a tenth of the population was killed in this bombing campaign and during this period and over the course of this civil war that only happened because of the United States in the first place. They still frame it as the U.S. bombing North Vietnamese supply trails. That's not true. That is not at all what was happening at the time. But you still see this story repeated endlessly today. In fact, as I was prepping this lecture, I went through Wikipedia, of course, because that's sort of the first port of call. And a lot of this stuff is still framed in these terms, that the North Vietnamese were operating in the country, and so the United States was forced to bomb them. That's just not the case. That is not what was happening. Of course, there was a war in Vietnam. Absolutely, the U.S. was trying to destroy these supply trails. But the bombing campaign was far wider than that and much more indiscriminate than that. And so this story that's portrayed throughout the media and then again on sources like Wikipedia is just not correct. It's still not correct. Now, I should say that there are plenty of places and really interesting projects that are trying to reckon with this history of what the United States did in Laos. One of them being the very interesting Legacies of War project, which you can go on legacesofwar.org, in fact, and get a little more research and some media stuff that are really trying to wrestle with this history. But still, this is still very much, if you get any of this history in the first place, this is probably the version that you're going to get today. Now, let's talk about Cambodia, which is the largest share of this chapter, probably the biggest section that Herman and Chomsky deal with. And it's such a big section that Herman and Chomsky actually end up splitting it into 3 separate sections. They talk about phase 1, which is between 1969 and 1975, where the U.S. is just bombing at unprecedented levels until the Khmer Rouge victory. And we'll talk a little more about the Khmer Rouge and how the Khmer Rouge are actually empowered by this bombing campaign that the United States is doing, and ends up framing itself against this American imperialism and rising to power because of that. We'll deal with that in just a second. Then there's phase 2, which is the regime of the Khmer Rouge and Pol Pot. And then, after that, there is phase 3, which is the Vietnamese invasion that ends up toppling Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge, installing the Heng Samrin regime. But the West continues to officially, at this point, recognize the Khmer Rouge, which is a truly wild turn of events, but we'll get to it. Right, in phase 1, you have this massive secret bombing, just like we saw in Laos. There were thousands of incidents that continued year over year, even after the ruler who was complaining about the bombing campaign, Prince Sihanouk, was replaced by a coup and by a murderous dictator called Lon Nol, who you may have heard about before. We should mention as well that the coup that toppled Sihanouk and ended up replacing him with Lon Nol was backed by the United States. And is that any surprise? Of course it is not. When Lon Nol comes to power, the U.S. officially withdraws its military presence from the region but continues to bomb. And again, this is over and over on an unprecedented scale. And most of the targets are out in the countryside. Just you're getting an American terror campaign against the peasantry of Cambodia. And the point that Herman and Chomsky make is that previous to this, the Khmer Rouge was fairly marginal. Cambodian affairs, for various reasons, were dominated by the French and by the Vietnamese for many, many years. And so the Khmer Rouge coming in, they were very much this sort of outside, homegrown party. However, now they're the resistance. You have this ongoing U.S. terror campaign that is starting to radicalize people, and it is during this period that you see the real titanic rise of the Khmer Rouge. And at this point, Lon Nol is acting just like a general sort of U.S. client would, sort of sitting back, watching things happen and enabling the Americans at every point. And so it's not like he's going to be particularly very much of a figure for the domestic Cambodian resistance at all. There's just really not that much opposition to the rise of the Khmer Rouge in popularity, who is at this point really the only viable way for the Cambodian people to make this madness stop. But what about the media? Well, the media, and this may shock you, but the media was very much on the American side. So throughout this bit, you have repeated military talking points extended and disseminated through the press. And there's this really insane bit on page 269, this passage here that quotes from a New York Times piece. The authors say, quote, "Correspondent Max Frankel, now executive editor, reported a Saigon Army ARVN attack on the Cambodian village of Chantrea with armored cars and bombers, leaving many villagers killed and wounded. The ARVN forces were accompanied by U.S. advisors, including a U.S. Army pilot dragged from the wreckage of an observer plane shot down in the action. Diplomats on the scene confirmed that at least one troop-carrying helicopter had landed at Chantrea with 3 Americans on board. Frankel was outraged at Cambodia, which had the gall to demand reparations, leaving Washington alarmed and saddened but confused. The headline reads, 'Stomping on U.S. toes, Cambodia typical of many small nations putting strain on a policy of patience.' What policy of patience? Anyway, this is a really mind-blowing bit that I had to go back and reread several times because it is astounding the way that this is presented. This is an American-caused atrocity being reported as, why is Cambodia complaining about this when the U.S. is so stoically persevering in their patience in the region and trying to help the poor Cambodians? And that, by the way, is the other side of this, because the American media framed all of this through the lens of a relentless enemy in terms of the Vietnamese, with the U.S. trying to support the beleaguered Cambodians who couldn't hold their own cities. And so you have another passage. This is another quote from page 275. Later on, when the authors pull passages again from the New York Times. Quote, "The Americans try, but with little success, to give the Cambodians some sense of confidence in their leadership." And then later, "The impending bombing cutoff is, quote, painful to the Cambodians because of the recent steady successes of enemy troops against overwhelming odds." And once again, we saw this last week, right? Throughout, there is this constant effort to frame the Americans always as the heroes. And in every sense, and in every war, and in every battle, as this information is trickling down through the military lens, and coming through those 5 filters that are set out in this book, we're always the heroes. That's what has to happen. But then after this, we get into phase 2. Phase 2 is where eventually the US-backed regime in Cambodia falls and Pol Pot takes power. Now, Pol Pot at this time is an American enemy, because he's just toppled their regime, their client state, and he gets called genocidal immediately. And the interesting thing here is that Herman and Chomsky actually compare the coverage of the evil Khmer Rouge that have just taken power in Cambodia to the slaughter in East Timor, which at this point the U.S. is backing. And what they say is that there's consternation over Pol Pot coming into Cambodia, and there's absolutely nothing for Timor at the same time. And yet again, I want to remind you, we have seen this before. This is the chapter that we did on worthy and unworthy victims coming back again. If you are in support of the United States, then you are a worthy victim. If you are anti-United States, then you are an unworthy victim. And it's the difference between, headline media coverage and descriptions of genocide and condemnations of Pol Pot and his regime, and just quiet, judicious silence on the other hand. But that brings us to phase 3. Phase 3 is Vietnam coming in and overthrowing the Khmer Rouge and installing a Vietnamese-backed regime. And this is when the United States starts to support, guess who? The Khmer Rouge and Pol Pot. Now, why do they do this? It's because at this point in Cambodia, the resistance to the new Vietnamese-installed regime in Cambodia is not going to be anti-communist. There's basically very little resistance that actually remains that isn't actively communist in the country. And so they have to pick one client to support, and that client ends up being the Khmer Rouge. So the Khmer Rouge, in this sense, just sort of the best option that remains. And the media goes into high gear because everything that went into attacking the Khmer Rouge and Pol Pot now goes into attacking Vietnam. Now Vietnam becomes the aggressor, the invader, the state that is coming in and acting like Prussia. There's this line in here that references the Prussians of Asia. It is remarkable to see this media machine just kick into high gear in condemning Vietnam for toppling the regime that the United States said was genocidal. Now, at the end of this chapter, we also get sort of an extended rant from Noam Chomsky, one of this classic Chomsky rants where he's breaking down accusations by William Shawcross that Western intellectuals, and Chomsky in particular, had tried to defend Pol Pot. That's all basically nonsense, but we're not really going to dwell on that too much here. Just to know that facing you in this chapter, if you want to read through it, is this extended and very intelligent, I will say, breakdown of Shawcross's arguments, and it's worth reading for sure. But listen, we're not really going to get too much into it in this video because there are more important things to talk about. The overall arc of this chapter is roughly the same as the one before it. This is just kind of completing the picture. So everything is coming into play yet again. The worthy and unworthy victims, the propaganda model, all of it. And we are left again, remember, with a very clear picture of the media at every step of the way following the elite consensus within the United States. Now, last time when we were talking about Vietnam, we saw how the media followed the general elite narrative at this point, even when it went against the interests of the American military at that time. Because the elite consensus in the United States at the time was, actually, we're really losing this war in Vietnam, and that gave them space to kind of report that angle out. In this case, this is much more cut and dried. This is just the stories that matter to the US military are presented as those headlines on the front page, and anything that is sort of against that just really doesn't make the paper. And it's remarkable how much of this is swept under the rug. Some of this is because this is very clandestine. A lot of this is happening under an administration, the Richard Nixon administration, that is keeping this completely under wraps because they're very much viewing this as a winnable conflict if only we can throw enough bombs at it. And then at the end of the day, you know, the media is there really to reinforce this narrative that the Americans are the heroes in all situations, and any American enemies must therefore be the villains. And that's why we see this complete flip-flop on the Khmer Rouge and the regime of Pol Pot, right? Genocidal, and then the United States government backs him, and not much more is said about the genocidal Khmer Rouge because now we have a new target. Now we're switching to Vietnam. Now, I love this pair of chapters. I think they go perfectly well together. And I think one of the crazy things, and I mentioned this last time, is that if you are going through the American school system, chances are you haven't heard this before. A lot of this material is completely new. We're just not taught about it. It's just not really mentioned. A lot of the media sources that we are given about this period don't even mention this bombing campaign really in any particular detail at all. So when I read this book several years ago, a lot of this material was completely new to me. And if it's completely new to you, I really recommend digging into this chapter, first of all, really trying to understand that history, and then going to check out some of the sources that I've highlighted on the Patreon channel, just extra reading around, extra documentary footage, extra stuff that you can be digging into this insane history that underlies this deeply evil American intervention throughout the Indochina Wars. But before we close this video, we're going to talk a little bit about the conclusion chapter. We're not going to spend too much time on this, but I do want to highlight a couple of things. First thing is that Herman and Chomsky raised the question of, what about Watergate? The media went crazy over Watergate. Why weren't they towing the government line then? The answer that Herman and Chomsky present, I think, is a very convincing one, actually. The answer that they present is that the scandal here in Watergate was the bugging of the Democratic Party's headquarters, which is a major party also of elites, also representing significant business interests. This is power versus power. And Herman and Chomsky know that the Socialist Workers' Party was also bugged by Nixon, and absolutely nobody cared. And then they bring up the journalist Ben Bagdikian. He has this quote where Bagdikian says that the institutional bias of the private mass media, quote, does not merely protect the corporate system. It robs the public of a chance to understand the real world. And I do think, whatever you think about Bagdikian, I do think that this is a profound quote. Like, this is a fantastic diagnosis, because it's not just that you're protecting the corporate world. Of course you are, but it's a distortion of reality. It's not just that some stories aren't surfacing. It's literally that the fabric of reality is bending to the whims of the corporate world. It's really, really remarkable. And I shouldn't say just corporate. There are many sources of power and many elites to be contended with, but Chomsky in particular is very concerned with the corporate power and concentrations of corporate power, and you will see that across the rest of his work. So we will talk a lot about that here. However, it comes back to this point of distortion, of unreality that we're being presented with. And this is significant as well because remember, Herman and Chomsky at the beginning and then also back again at this concluding chapter are saying the United States media doesn't work like the media in a totalitarian dictatorship does. It's almost more pernicious, and it will foster things like debate and contention and dissidence and opposing viewpoints and all of that, as long as all of that dissent is within the parameters set by the system. As soon as you break out of that, it becomes nonsense. It's not part of the real world. But if you can, bring on a talking head from one side of the corporate world and another side of the corporate world that disagree with each other over some small thing, of course, that is a debate that we can have. That's a free and open, non-totalitarian media ecosystem. But as soon as you depart from those lines that have been drawn, that's when it becomes a problem. And then I think is kind of the central idea that you should come away from a work like Manufacturing Consent with is this idea that the media that you're seeing is in its own way not free at all. It's still within these strictures of a very specific paradigm. And if you want something that departs from that, some understanding of the truth that is not the received truth from sources of power, you have to work quite hard to get that, and to get that from a source that you really trust. And that brings us to the end of Manufacturing Consent. Thank you, as always, for watching. If you've made it through this, congratulations. It's a really fantastic book. Go tell people about this. I really think that if more people read works like Manufacturing Consent, there would be better media literacy in the world. There would be a better understanding of the way that information is fed to us. All of this, I could truly rant an hour about why everybody should read Manufacturing Consent. But listen, I'll just close by saying thank you very much. Let me know what you think, as always. Next week, we'll be back for an introduction lecture on our next book, which is Emma Goldman's Anarchism and Other Essays. One of the most famous, if not the most famous and most consequential American anarchist. Emma Goldman is a treasure. She's a deeply, deeply controversial figure. So there are people who despise Emma Goldman. I personally love Emma Goldman. However, you will see why she is so divisive in these essays. And we're going to be breaking that down next week. So thank you very much for watching, as always. And I'll see you soon. Thank you again.